Time has expired. Senator Roberts.
Thank you. This is not the first time the Senate has debated the need for an inquiry into the effect of industrial wind, industrial solar and transmission lines on rural and remote Australia. The reason is simple. As I travel through Queensland listening with my constituents, they let me know in very clear language there must be an inquiry into this scam, into this destruction. I want to name and honour and express my appreciation for people from Victoria through to New South Wales, to southern Queensland, central Queensland, north Queensland, for standing up in rural communities in particular, but also city folks increasingly. And I want to single out two names in particular, Katie McCullum and Jim Wilmot. People in this protest movement know of them, and I thank them for their outstanding work. Katie has been a real dynamo, full of information. Thank you so much. Now, Australia's net zero energy transition is a complete disaster. These things are destroying Australia's productive capacity, taking a coal-powered generation capacity that offers cheap, reliable, affordable, accessible, secure, stable energy to industry and to homeowners and families, and turning that into a catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, unreliable catastrophe. Jobs are being destroyed and exported to China. In January, Alcoa announced the closure of the Kwinana aluminium smelter with the loss of 850 staff, 850 jobs and 250 contractors, a closure caused in part by Australia losing its competitive advantage in power. And that's extremely important. The cheaper the energy, the more reliable the energy, the more competitive a country is, the more productive a country is, the higher the standard of living, the higher the wealth. For everyone. That has been the message for the last 170 years of history, and we are committing economic suicide. A report into Victoria's renewable energy and storage targets, released and then withdrawn last month, stated the following, quote, "Achieving net zero requires the construction of unprecedented," there's that word again, "unprecedented amounts of renewable energy in Victoria, more than 15 times today's installed renewable capacity, according to the current best estimates. More than 15 times what's already been installed." It continues, "Analysis indicates that to meet net zero targets using onshore renewables could require up to 70% of Victoria's agricultural land to host wind and solar farms." That's their word. 70%. Well, good luck with that, because you'd be starving watching the wind turbines not even turning, the solar panels cooking the earth. Finally, the truth is out there. No wonder this Labor government is buying back water, eliminating major infrastructure in regional and remote Australia, in short, making life tougher and tougher for the bush, hollowing out the bush. No wonder approvals are being guided through for bug and lab-grown protein. This will be our food source once the net zero agenda is completed. Don't believe me? Go and listen to the globalists, the parasitic globalists. They've said exactly that. This Labor government has every intention of turning the bush into one giant industrial landscape of wind, solar, batteries and transmission lines and pump storage. It's anti-human. The Minister for Misery, Mr Chris Bowen, is wrecking the bush. The Minister for Misery, Mr Chris Bowen, is wrecking Australia. The Minister for Misery, Mr Chris Bowen, is killing people's lifestyle in this country and killing our futures. With just enough land left over now to grow beautiful quality beef and agricultural products for the billionaire parasites the Prime Minister is so fond of hobnobbing with. So they'll shut down agriculture, except for that small quantity for the parasitic billionaires. Produce that will, of course, be available to the nomenclatura, the class of bureaucrats, journalists, academics and politicians who promote these measures with the understanding they will never be restricted by them. This is the truth of the net zero agenda. Now, I travelled through far north Queensland in January and visited the areas to be desecrated with wind turbines. I learned about the aquifers that run from the tablelands of beautiful, amazing Atherton tablelands, amazingly productive land, out to the Great Barrier Reef, taking water under the sea and then feeding onto the reef as far as 50 kilometres offshore. Fact. These ancient aquifers will carry any pollutants, including naturally occurring arsenic, out to the reef, out to our beautiful Great Barrier Reef. pollutants that are being disturbed by construction of these wind turbines. I saw the rock slides that occurred during the recent cyclones, which residents reported as being the worst they remember. Climate hasn't changed. That's natural up in North Queensland because of the wet summers. Rock slides that extended from the top of the mountains to the road at sea level. This is natural in North Queensland. Beautiful mountains, lots of rain. What caused this devastation in an area that is part of the same mountain range where wind turbines will be erected? So they're going to loosen the mountains, the mountain tops. If the government is not getting up there with seismologists and surveyors to see what caused these rock slides, then the outcome may be more devastation, will be more devastation. There's been too much looking the other way, turning a blind eye, too much wishful thinking in the planning for net zero, too much blindness, people groping around in the dark, ignoring the data. This inquiry will be a chance to ask hard questions about the real environmental and financial cost to Australia and the real impact on regional and rural and remote Australia. I want to read from some notes. I want to honour and appreciate Steve Nowakowski. He was in bed with the Greens. He's a dedicated conservationist, which made him wake up to the fact that the Greens are not conservationists, they're just anti-human. He had the courage. He was in with the Greens in their election campaigns, booth captain, very much pushing their agenda. But he had the courage to inquire, to ask questions, the courage to change, the courage to oppose once he woke up, the courage to get the data and tell the truth, the courage to speak out. Steve Nowakowski. There has never been any data from any government agency anywhere in the world, nor from any institute, nor from any university, that shows the underlying logical scientific points and empirical scientific evidence to justify this climate fraud. There's been no data for solar and wind. The CSIRO's gen cost, as other senators in this parliament have attested, is a complete fraud. It is fraudulent. They're basing their conclusions on false evidence, false data. They've fabricated it. They've omitted solid cost data, because what they want to show is the government's policy of solar and wind. Solar and wind are not the cheapest. They're by far the most expensive. First comes hydro, second comes coal, third comes nuclear, then way, way behind comes solar and wind. I'll read some of the things that are happening, because some people in the world are waking up. This is an article from Chris Mitchell in The Australian yesterday. Some environmental journalists are blind to what's really happening globally in fossil fuel use and the renewable energy transition. This certainly seems to suit Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen, who is failing to meet his government's commitments on the electricity network rollout and power price reductions. Promised by the government, but so far prices have continued rising, and they will continue to rise. On almost every energy issue, Bowen and his media cheer squad ignore setbacks in the Northern Hemisphere, where coal and gas are being burned at record levels. The US is winding back electric vehicle mandates. Two of Europe's biggest car makers, Volvo and Renault, are reducing electric vehicle investment, and the EU, the European Union, looks likely to start to unravel its commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. Mercedes is cutting back. Toyota and Honda were never committed anyway, and now they're openly talking about it. Thermal coal use globally reached an all-time record in 2023. Global coal exports topped 1 billion tonnes, and coal-fired electricity generation between October 2022 and October 2023 was up 1% to 8,295 terawatt-hours. Emissions from coal-fired power last year topped 7.85 billion tonnes of CO2, up 67 million tonnes. Up, because they don't see this problem, because they know the data. While coal use fell in Europe and North America, that was more than offset by coal burnt in Asia. Indonesia was the world's biggest exporter of thermal coal last year. They've passed us. We used to be. 505.4 million tonnes of thermal coal exported, and Australia number 2 at 198. 40% of what Indonesia exported. And our production is up 7%. But we can't burn it here. We can give our wonderful energy to other countries and let them burn it and make cheap energy. Use of gas globally rose 0.5% last year as China emerged from lockdowns. That growth is expected to increase to 3.5% this year. Hydroelectric generation and biofuels, which can count as renewable energy, exceeded wind and solar in the renewables ledger. So the renewables ledger is rubbish. It's mostly hydro. But even so, renewables globally rose, but wind and solar accounted for only 12% of all power used. The Bloomberg Energy newsletter that publishes on Substack went through the latest International Energy Agency coal numbers. It points out China now uses 55% of the world's coal, and we sell it to them. They produce now 4.5 billion tonnes and want to get to 5 billion tonnes. We produce 560 million tonnes, 1/8 to 1/9 what they produce. Coal makes up 70% of China's CO2 emissions. And who cares? Because CO2 emissions we don't control as humans. The level of carbon dioxide is controlled by nature. I'll continue with the article. Even The Guardian now acknowledges China is approving new coal power projects at the rate of 2 plants a week. Yet, in much of the Australian media, China is regularly described as a green superpower. Sure, it exports wind and solar components made in China with coal-fired electricity that sabotages our energy because we have to subsidise the solar and wind. Writes Bloomberg. China is, quote, more than happy to profit from countries willing to sacrifice themselves at the altar of the Church of Carbon, and even happier to recycle these profits into securing coal at prices lower than they would otherwise be if so much international demand hadn't been voluntarily removed from the market. China is being helped because other countries are taking coal off the market, so China pays less price. India, the number 3 carbon dioxide emitter, pledges to hit net zero in 2070. The functional equivalent of never, Bloomberg says. India has announced an extra 88 gigawatts of capacity by 2032, 8 years away, up 63% from the projections released in May. Solar and wind is just for show, and they've basically admitted that. They're not going to commit suicide because they've seen us liberate our people with hydrocarbon-fuelled coal, oil and natural gas. The world has little chance of meeting net zero by 2050. Figures released in December at COP28, the UN's GabFest in Dubai, showed CO2 emissions up 1.1% last year, despite a fall of 490 million metric tonnes outside China and India. China's emissions rose 458 million tonnes and India's 233 million. Predictions electric vehicles will conquer the motoring world are proving just as inaccurate as peak coal forecasts. That's terribly inaccurate. Both Porsche and the European Union are pushing for delays to Europe's commitment to phase out internal combustion engine cars. Porsche Chief Financial Officer Lutz Meschke told Bloomberg last month he believed the European Union's 2035 deadline for stopping ICE internal combustion engine manufacture could be delayed. Politico reported on January 18th that the manifesto of the European People's Party, the continent's largest conservative political force, wanted the unwinding of the 2035 internal combustion engine ban. They want it undone, reversed. Volvo, which has been telling the world it's moving to electric cars, bragging to the world, only last month said it would no longer provide financial support to the loss-making Polestar electric vehicle maker and would look at selling its 48% stake to Chinese parent company Geely. French giant Renault has scrapped the separate listing of its EV unit Ampere, according to London's Daily Telegraph on February 2nd. Toyota, which environmentalists last year were criticising for being a laggard on EVs, again looks to have made the right call on continuing to invest in hybrid technology. And I want to point out the German government, the EU, the UK government, to some extent, and largely in the UK, have cut their net zero ambitions in half. Some have even called it off. In the time remaining, I just want to point out that people in this Senate receive money from Climate 200, which is funded by Simon Holmes à Court, who is making money off solar and wind subsidies. So Teal's people in the lower house, Teal's Senator David Pocock, gets money from Climate 200. They're getting money from parasitic billionaires to push the agenda for making these parasitic billionaires billions more in subsidies. That is a fact. And then they blindly turn away from looking at the devastation that solar and wind are causing. No wonder people in the rural communities and right across Australia are tired of the higher prices for solar and wind, higher prices for electricity and the devastation on our forests and our farming communities. We need inquiry.
Senator Roberts.